English translation, 557th Contact Sunday, the 31st of March 2013, 22:45 hours.
You are already waiting, dear friend. Because you had said that you will not come until 23 o'clock HRS, I first drank a coffee in the kitchen. But be welcome and greeted accordingly. However, why are you coming today? Didn't we talk about you coming next Saturday, specifically for correction work with Bernadette?
Even for my part, I extend my greetings to you. What you say is right, but something has arisen that requires my presence elsewhere on next Saturday. Therefore, Florina or Anjana will then take over the correction work. But since there are some things that I want to discuss privately with you which seem important to me, I am coming today.
Can we do that later? Because look here. There I have copied various excerpts from the contact conversations, on which I have some questions.
That does not pose a problem. So bring up your questions.
Thank you. Look here. This excerpt refers to the Shroud of Turin, that is to say, winding sheet.
Excerpt, 437th Official Contact Conversation on the 18th of November, 2006, Volume 11, page 56.
During the whole deception, a Jew was involved whose name we could not determine, but who inflicted a wound on himself in order to fabricate the forgery and caught the blood that was used to prepare the relics.
To this end, I was asked what wound the man had inflicted on himself in order to use it to smear the cloth that is now known as the Shroud of Turin. Are you able to say anything more specific about it?
That is indeed the case, yes. The man was a Jew responsible for the traces of blood on the shroud, which had been created by a man named Luciano Canova, an alchemist, in 1324. However, this man already died a little more than a year later. Hence, his entire legacy was sold, whereby the shroud then fell into the hands of the man who put the blood traces on the shroud. The man was of Jewish origin and a fraud, counterfeiter, liar, and swindler. Since our last conversation on this matter, held by two of us in 2008, I have also been able to fathom its real name and further details. He was a man of about 180 centimeters in size, just about as tall as the deceased merchant Caesar Canova, who was depicted on the cloth in his death. He was called Jishak bin Nun, and he was a man who, as explained, spent his life with swindles, lies, counterfeiting, and fraud, whereby nothing was of sufficient dignity and value for him not to eke out his criminal life through cheating, falsification, lying, and swindle. When it came to passing off the cloth as a shroud with regard to its name as that of Jesus of Nazareth, it was not too much for him to let an accomplice inflict the so-called Christ marks on all the right areas under the pain-killing influence of a drug, after which then immediately the shroud was laid very exactly on him, whereby the blood impressions resulted exactly at the precisely determined locations on the cloth, which was then in the year 1352 sold for a high price to the French king Jean II Le Bon. These are the facts that I was still able to fathom in relation to the facts of the falsification of blood. This did not give rise to any further interest on my part. Consequently, I am also not further busying myself with the matter.
Well, that also is enough, and it is more than I had expected. Then my last question. Recently I watched a television program that dealt with the forms of lightning that your daughter Simya made me see during various thunderstorms in 1975, which for me were fantastic observations that I will never forget. You call these flashes of lightning shooting high up collective lightning strikes. Simya and Quetzal talked about this several times privately in the 1970s and 1980s, because I was interested in it. Then in 1989, Quetzal said the following in an official conversation about it.
Excerpt, 230th Official Contact Conversation on the 11th of October, 1989, Volume 6, page 110.
However, while we are on these matters, I would also like to ask you a question about the lightning strikes that occur high above the clouds at altitudes of between 35 and 100 kilometers. By this I mean the red lightning strikes, which in turn produce blue lightning strikes in the surroundings, which shoot up as far as the ionosphere.
These are so-called collective lightning strikes, as we call them. Each thunderstorm discharge leaves behind certain electrical energies and gases, which settle high above the clouds and accumulate up to a critical mass. Once this is reached, an ignition of the same takes place, which then causes the red lightning phenomenon, through which blue discharges are emitted in their surroundings, which shoot up into the sky with more than 100 kilometers per second. It depends on the intensity of the thunderstorm discharges when the critical mass is reached, and an ignition can take place. Between 90 and 110 thunderstorm discharges are normally necessary before the critical mass is reached, and an ignition can occur.
Today, scientists call the red lightnings red sprites, which actually rise up to 50 kilometers or so, and the blue lightnings, which shoot up as far as nearby outer space, are called blue jets. My question on this: which substances do these sprites and blue jets produce as well as the normal lightnings?
They create ozone and nitrogen oxides. Normal lightnings produce up to 200 kilograms of ozone and about 90% of the nitrogen oxides.
Concerning the lightning, which we call the Freddy lightning, because it exploded approximately a mere half-meter in front of him and me after it swished around the corner of the house. Even though there was no thunderstorm, Quetzal once said that it had not originated above the Schmidruti area. Where did it actually come from?
It was a positive lightning emanating from a distant thunderstorm. To put it in other words, we found out that there was a thunderstorm at a distance of several kilometers, namely above Bauma, from which a flash of lightning emanated, which reached all the way to the center and ultimately tore the air in front of you and Freddy, which you two perceived as an explosion.
Interesting. Then this. During the 288th and 344th official contact conversation, there was talk of Gustav Weisskopf, who was the first to fly with a motorplane, a fact that has, however, since been continually denied worldwide. Indeed, at that time I wrote to the editorial staff of the magazine Spiegel, who also called everything into question. At that time, for example, you said the following, evidenced by this excerpt from the report.
288th Contact Report, the 23rd of July, 2000.
The first motorplane that actually flew was built and flown by someone named Gustav Weisskopf. He was a German man who emigrated to America. His airplane was indeed airworthy, as I have already said with my explanation. But this fact was fallaciously twisted, and by means of a transatlantic plot, the Americans came to praise and honor via the Wright brothers. Truthfully, Gustav Weisskopf was the actual pioneer of the motorplane and the flying with motorplanes, but not the Wright brothers.
It seems that the truth still comes to light now, despite all the old lies and defamations against Gustav Weisskopf. On this subject, I received the following from Achim Wolff, together with a newspaper article, which I transcribed for the September Special Bulletin Nummer 73. He wrote the following. In a contact conversation, 288th Contact Report, dated the 23rd of July 2000, Volume 8, as well as 344th Contact Report, dated the 29th of June 2003, Volume 9, between Billy and Patar 1 spoke of the fact that it was not the Wright brothers who completed the first motor flight in December 1903, but the German Gustav Weisskopf from Leutershausen in central Franconia, who had already done so 2.5 years earlier. Press releases from early March 2013 now confirm this fact with new cognitions as follows. Greetings with love, and Salome Achim Wolff, Germany.
New facts. Did Weisskopf succeed with the first motor flight? Does a Franconian push the aviation pioneers from the throne? The 10th of March, 2013, 11:47 hours.
Leutershausen, is there a need to rewrite the history of aviation? At least that's what historian John Brown believes. For him, the Middle Franconian Gustav Weisskopf completed the world's first motorized flight and thus pushed the Wright brothers from the throne. New findings lead to this conclusion. New findings have reignited the decades-long dispute over the world's first motorized flight. Intensive research in the archives would prove that Gustav Weisskopf, who originated from Leutershausen in central Franconia, had already completed his first motor flight 2.5 years ahead of the Wright brothers, reported Braunschweig aviation historian John Brown in Leutershausen, Weisskopf's birthplace, during the weekend. Until now, the U.S.-American brothers Wright were considered the first pilots of a motorized aircraft in the world, with their flight in December 1903. Brown, who is at the same time an aircraft builder, cites historical newspaper reports and, albeit only a blurred picture of Weisskopf's first official motorized flight on the 14th of August 1901 at Bridgeport Fairfield in the U.S. state of Connecticut. He claims to have discovered the picture, which had previously been considered untraceable, in a photograph of Weisskopf's stand at the first Aero Club America exhibition in New York in 1906. It was attached to a blackboard. Thanks to modern photo analyses, one would have succeeded in making the flight scene depicted on it visible. A comparison with a newspaper lithograph prepared on the basis of this photo would indicate with a high degree of probability that it was the photo of Weisskopf's maiden flight. Until now, historians had doubted Weisskopf's pioneering deed, among other things because of a missing photo evidence. In the light of the now discovered historical photography and other new indications, the well-founded doubts about Weisskopf's motorized first flight would be dispelled, emphasized the Australian-born Brown. Furthermore, his research would have refuted the long-held opinion among historians that Weisskopf would have been a technical dilettante. Allegedly, his claimed pioneering deed was only reported in the local newspaper. Brown explained that factually, a simple internet search by him would have yielded more than 300 newspaper articles worldwide in which Weisskopf's first motorized flight had been reported. In addition, Weisskopf would have been a trained constructor of motors, who had supplied many motors to aircraft manufacturers in the first decade of the 20th century. Still on Saturday evening, Weisskopf's pioneering deed was acknowledged by Paul Jackson, publisher of Jane's All the World's Aircraft, one of the most important aviation history journals. In a statement broadcast live from Great Britain, Jackson declared Gustav Weisskopf the world's first motorized flight pilot. Prior to this, he had already commended Weisskopf's pioneering deed on his website. Literally, it reads there, "Delayed justice is denied justice, and the second mouse gets the cheese. Weisskopf has done the work, the Wrights have taken the cream." DPA Klaus Scharnke.
The truth concerning the first motor flight by Gustav Weisskopf, just as concerning all other things of the reality, can never be hidden, slandered, or denied for all times, because sooner or later every truth finds its way to the light.
Exactly. How has it been called since time immemorial? As the light illuminates the darkness, so shines the truth above the lie and calumny.
That is a word from my father.
Yes, those are his words because he often used that phrase. Unfortunately, lying, concealing, and slandering are unattractive things among the earthlings, which are customary and, accordingly, cause evil, negative, and bad thoughts and feelings in those who have fallen prey to these wrong behaviors. In particular, thoughts and feelings concerning lies and slander influence, damage, and weaken the immune system, and so do all other forms of negative thoughts and feelings. Hence, many sufferings and diseases are promoted or even triggered by them. It is therefore not only negative and bad thoughts and feelings in relation to one's own well-being or non-well-being which further suffering and illnesses, but also the wrong thought-feeling-based behaviors regarding the lying, slandering, as well as concerning the deeds and actions connected with them. Therefore, many people who have become addicted to the lie and the calumny have also fallen prey to sufferings and illnesses which, in each case according to the intensity of the lies and calumny, are as a rule manifested by psychic and psychosomatic harms. This is how your father Schwath taught me in my youth.
I am aware of that. Yet the facts you mentioned are still unknown to earthly psychological science.
If so, it can after all in future be read in this conversation, once I have retrieved it as a report of conversation and written it down. But still another question, which I can actually answer myself. It is concerning the High Council, Nocodemian, and Enoch, and so on. For this, I once asked you how those are to be written and spoken, whereupon you asked your experts knowledgeable in languages and writing. It was said to this that proper names should always be written and preserved in their original form. Thus, for example, always only High Council, Nocodemian, Quran, and Henoch, etc. Therefore, the High Councils, Henochs, or Nocodemians must never be used. It was also explained that in correct German spelling and speaking a proper name must never end with a S, such as for example Nocodemians, Qurans, or Henochs, etc. Hence each name must be preceded by a corresponding article like the or of, and the sentence must be shaped in such a way that the name remains in its original form. Thus, it must be called, for example, the or of the Nocodemian, Enoch, Heinrich, Agatha, Quran, Talmud, Rita, Vera, etc., as was explained. And names, for example, Jacobus, or Theophilus, or Clematis, etc., which have an S ending must not be provided with an apostrophe. Regarding High Council, one can only say and write the High Council or of the High Council because here too the proper name must be preserved. Do I interpret this correctly?
Your explanation corresponds to what our scholars of languages and scriptures have explained, as I have also passed this on to you.
We will adhere to this in the future, but unfortunately these rules are not yet taken into account in older publications and works, because we did of course not yet know them and used the wrong forms of the usual German way of writing and speaking. We had indeed no clue that the German language and its way of writing were distorted by all the pathologically foolish language know-it-alls, because they constantly think they would have to improve the language and written language, whereby, however, the correct ways of speaking and writing get lost. As a result, the grammar and thus the correct word order are obviously also demolished. That is to say, the oral linguistic and written forms, principles, and their function and structure in the sentence.
Which is in fact the way you say it is.
On top of that, there is the Denglisation of the German language, as is unfortunately idiotically done today by combining many words of the infant language English, as you once called it, with words of the German language.
Doing so is the way of human beings whose intelligence is deficient and who are therefore unable to assess the great value of the German language and to master it correctly. This also applies to those whom you call language know-it-alls, who change the German language in a detrimental way, because they do not understand the real terms and words in their fundamental value, and consequently do not know which values are contained in them and what they mean fundamentally.
Well said, because it reflects exactly what already your father Schwath explained to me. It was indeed him who taught me to fathom the actual deep sense of each term and word, because only by doing so can we understand what is hidden in its origin and what must fundamentally be understood about it. Unfortunately, however, this sometimes leads to misunderstandings, because human beings generally understand it as something other than the origin of the term and the word. Even etymologic books often expound the origins of terms and words incorrectly.
Unfortunately, this is in fact the case, as I know from our language scholars. However, when we already speak of books, it is perhaps time that Bernadette and you made an effort to write your biography, because time does not stand still, and the lifetime of both of you is dwindling. Therefore, it would be of necessity that you two find a time rule to do the necessary work together.
Of course you are right. Thus I will talk to Bernadette and see what we can do.
You know, time is pressing.
I am conscious of that, yes. However, unfortunately, only Bernadette is there to bring my books and the contact conversations to a clean state so that they can be printed. Things are going extremely sluggish regarding the kind of new core group members who would also be able to deal with this work. That is a problem. Hence, nobody will be able to do this work once Bernadette will have gone her last way. But the writing work is very important and cannot simply lie dormant.
I am conscious of this problem. Unfortunately, many suitable human beings hesitate to join the core group because they do not want to take on the tasks and efforts as well as the lifelong obligations. They just want to indulge in their pleasure and their leisure time and furthermore, only want to profit from the mission on a personal level. It is just much simpler and easier to be only a beneficiary than to be actually voluntarily and without pay strictly cooperating for the probably most valuable mission ever on the earth.
To this nothing more is to be said, because your words hit the nail exactly on the head. But now a question concerning the irrational, crazy and confused young dictator Kim Jong Un, as well as his vassals in North Korea, from whom threats of war against South Korea and US America constantly emanate. What can we make of this? Are these simply empty threats, or is this gang of criminals really so megalomaniac that they want to make their threats come true? What do you think about that?
Because I am based on my interest also dealing with earthly politics, I analyze these concerns too. Unfortunately, it has to be said about this that Kim Jong Un is a psychopath and that the entire staff surrounding him are really irrational and confused and that their threats are meant seriously. On one hand, the political and military-political situation between the earthly states has calmed down very satisfactorily in the last decades. Leaving aside the criminal acts of war by the USA and its allies in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as various military rebellious acts of revolution and war within various states themselves. In this context, of course, the liberation struggles in those states in which the populations overthrew their governments in order to be free are also included. Just as the old predictions, which can also be found in the Talmud Emmanuel, report it. Now, however, the new factor North Korea is coming to the fore, which once again threatens the previously satisfactory political situation in the world. Although this danger was to be taken into consideration when Kim Jong Un came to the might and seized his dictatorship, the fact that the entire situation is arising so quickly and that the hitherto painstakingly achieved satisfactory political and military world situation is endangered is extraordinary. If everything would have developed within the upfront calculable scope, a state of permanent empty threats would simply have developed. However, this has changed very quickly and very radically. Because Kim Jong Un has fallen unusually fast prey to a pathological megalomania and a schizophrenic lunacy, as my medical investigations have established. Many of those who have his military might are also completely unpredictable creatures. As well as haters of South Korea and the USA, just as is characteristic of the unpredictable dictator Kim Jong Un, therefore no rationality can be expected from them either. Yet even if at present only threats and threatening gestures are part of North Korea's agenda, there is nevertheless the great danger given that suddenly the tiny bit of rationality that is still present in the one or the other high-ranking responsible military officer fails. If this were the case, a major calamity would result, not least because the Chinese rulers allied with North Korea are also unpredictable in their decisions and actions.
That means there is no certainty whether one will go haywire or not. Did you perhaps make probability calculations or foresights?
No. The entire situation is unfortunately not searchable, because no probability calculations can be made. Namely because Kim Jong Un and all the determining ones having the might are totally unpredictable in their moods, so these can change dramatically from one split second to the next. For this reason, it is, regarding their decisions and actions, not possible to produce high percentage and tangible probability calculations. And as far as foresights are concerned, we do not make them because, as I had already explained in the past, we only carried them out because you had kindly asked us to do so. And as it was decided, you know it, we have not been making an effort at foresights for quite some time.
It was just a question. However, how do you see the whole situation in relation to a world war, which might still develop in future time?
Unfortunately, this possibility has to be taken into consideration time and again, given the greedy for might ones who pose as dictators in various states. But even in the case of non-dictatorial individuals who rather exercise political might in another way, the danger is always given that, suddenly or in the long term, wars may be provoked which could spread worldwide. Unfortunately, it is still the case in practically all states of the world that the rulers determine such actions, whereby the people themselves usually have no say in it, because nowhere is there an actual and real democracy, through which alone the peoples would be able to determine things. Also, what is nowadays referred to as direct democracy is in reality only a partial democracy, like it is, for example, the case with Switzerland, as you know.
Yes, I know, because over there the parties prevail, which determine the course, just like the Federal Council, the Council of States, and the National Council, whose say ultimately decides. However, tell me, what do you think in regard to the climate? Can it still to be saved?
It is too late for this, because as a result of the effects of the overpopulation mass, everything has been so much destroyed that no longer change for the better can be brought about in the near future. The exploited resources of the earth have been irreversibly destroyed and no longer can be regenerated, and I mean not even in millions of years. Admittedly, the damage done to the surface nature of the earth through human irrationality can be partially regenerated in the course of time, which, however, will take many decades or several centuries of time if no further destructions are still carried out. Through the earth-human delusion of breeding and excessive overpopulation, these destructions are continuing unrestrictedly and become steadily even worse the more blatantly the overpopulation increases. And it is this excessively high number of Earth humans which causes all of the catastrophes, evils, and destructions, because the growing number requires ever more perversions through which the human needs can still be covered. And that these perversions in every technological, industrial and chemical, etc., as well as resources exploitation ways and in all-around nature destructive ways, always progress further and gradually cause an inability for life of the planet as well as the Earth humans themselves. No one thinks about this, particularly not the responsible ones of the sciences and the governments. Thus, one continues to inflict ever greater and ever faster progressing irreparable damages and destructions on nature and on the planet itself. Just as there is also no world-encompassing containment of the overpopulation, which can only be the case through a worldwide birth-stop regulation, namely within the framework. As it has already often been mentioned, however, steadily more human beings, that is to say, a continually raging overpopulation increase, means that more and constantly increasing severe perversions become visible, and as a result, the destructions and their faster advances become unstoppable. In many places, the oceans are so poisoned that all life has died in them, or they are so polluted with plastics and other debris that the sea creatures and sea plants die of it. Forests are clear cut of trees or burnt down and destroyed to such an extent that the soil dries out and passes to a state of desertification. From this in turn results that through the emergence of deserts, tremendous sandstorms arise, which whirl enormous amounts of sand and dust into the air and push it around the world. So entire landscapes and villages become covered with sand and become uninhabitable and lifeless. The dust particles drift high into the atmosphere and into the clouds, become saturated with moisture particles, and in turn fall as rain onto the earth. However, this is no longer in the normal way, but in enormous thunderstorms which bring tremendous destructions and also claim human lives. The earth is hollowed out through mining, as well as through underground explosions and likewise by the extraction of the earth petroleum, the groundwaters and gases and the ores, etc., and the weights of the villages, cities and reservoirs which press down on the earth. Likewise cause earth tremors and earthquakes, as does the rising of the land, which is pushed down beneath the enormous ice masses of Greenland, the glaciers, the Arctic, and Antarctica. The earthquakes in turn lead among other things to earth shifts and volcanic eruptions, whereby due to the volcano smoke, ash and poisonous gases are whirled into the air and up till high into the atmosphere, as well as all around the world, which also leads again to tremendous weather changes, storms, and much harm. Through the warming of the earth, the uncovering of the methane gas deposits in the ocean beds, as well as in the permafrost soils and permafrost rock occurs, and the atmosphere gets infused with the toxic gas. This is done equally by the exhaust gases of the many millions of cattle and by the other animals and other creatures which are bred and fattened as food for the blatant Earth-human overpopulation. This together with all the C02, which is produced by all these animals. The other creatures and by the mass of human beings comprising more than 8.3 thousand million and which will slowly but surely become a problem for the preservation of all life. The freshwater bodies, such as streams, rivers, streams, and lakes, are poisoned in such a way that nothing living can be found in them anymore, nor that they can be used for anything by human beings of Earth, in particular no more as drinking water and water for cleaning the body or clothes. On the other hand, however, in many places the fresh water of water bodies is irresponsibly diverted from streams. Rivers and lakes to irrigate all kinds of plantations operated profit greedily, irrespective of the fact that the water bodies dry up and their bottom becomes desolate. And in many cases, the drying up of the water bodies not only has a destructive effect on the surrounding land and very detrimental and life-threatening effects on the human beings surrounding them, but also on the local climate or even on the continental or worldwide climate, as is known to be the case in Europe regarding the Aral Sea. Yet there would be much more to say about all these catastrophic conditions and destructions caused by the overpopulation, which, however, would probably be senseless because all warnings and enumerations of all catastrophic machinations are truthfully in vain.
There you say a word of truth, because the majority of the Earthlings are absolutely stubborn and unteachable. On the other hand, however, is also to say that there are good documentaries which point out all of the evils mentioned by you and even a great deal more gross and destructive effects. But these documentary films are as a rule only shown late at night on the television, instead of at a time when the humans sit attentively in front of the box. But this is probably done deliberately, because the culpable ones who cause all the destructions certainly have an influence on the television stations and can keep them in check with bribes so that the people do not learn the real truth. So also on a large scale it is concealed from the people that, as you say, brooks, rivers and lakes are irreparably poisoned or pumped empty for the irrigation of plantations in order to water flower, vegetable and other plant cultures, namely by flower, vegetable and large plant breeders in various countries, like for example in Africa and Israel as well as in Russia, etc. Likewise, it is kept secret from the world population that notable groups of food companies, etc., steal the drinking water, fill this into bottles and other containers, and then sell it expensively back to the human beings. And this happens in such a way, although the drinking water is fundamentally a planet-owned and nature-given common good for all life forms on the Earth, so that they can cover their need for liquid. This is not only theft from nature, but also from the human beings and from all other life forms in need of drinking water. Actually, the entire matter is even tolerated by the authorities and the governments. Namely that the drinking water is also stolen from the population and they have to buy it at a high price from the profit-greedy corporations. It is probably undeniable that in many places the specialists who draw up expert reports, as well as the scientists and various authorities and government officials, also trade in bribes. It is understandable, of course, that a certain fee has to be paid where drinking water tested and controlled for hygienic purity is pumped to the ultimate consumers through costly distribution pumping stations and pipelines from reservoirs all the way to households. Bakeries and food businesses, stables, hospitals, and all kinds of buildings and wells. That is because the water treatment and distribution facilities as well as the entire machinery obviously have to be maintained, which is not exactly cheap.
That can be understood and is right. But now, dear friend, we should end our conversation, because there are still some important things to discuss, such as, for example, first of all, the following.